our guest speaker. So, thank you all for joining us on this beautiful sunny day. We are very fortunate to have Charlotte Cadow with us. A few years ago, our colleague at Urban and Community Forestry, Joanne Garton, was on a webinar with some Indigenous people from the Northeast, and they were expressing their concern about the fact that emerald ash borer is here and is going to be causing destruction to a lot of our ash trees. And they put out sort of a request for folks to help do whatever is possible to understand and preserve this important species as much as is possible to do. So Urban and Community Forestry was very fortunate to have Charlotte Cadow, who is just about to get her master's from the Vermont Field Naturalist program and spend a little over the last year working on this very important species. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Char.
Awesome. Thank you, Ginger. Thanks for that introduction. As Ginger mentioned, my name is Charlotte Cadow, and I am a master's student in the UVM Field Naturalist program. I am not Indigenous, but would like to quickly recognize the many generations of Indigenous people who have shaped the land where I'm currently sitting, specifically the Western Abenaki. For my master's project, I've spent a little over the last year working with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry program to do a combination of outreach and research on Vermont's black ash trees. These trees are also called brown ash, hoop ash, swamp ash, and basket ash. So maybe you've heard them called that name before. And we've really worked to consider black ash in the broader context, recognizing that these trees bear cultural and ecological importance throughout northeastern North America. So today I'm excited to share some of our work with you, and I'm going to start with some background information about basic ash ID, then jump into black ash ID, and then move into the cultural importance, some of the cultural importance to Indigenous people. Then of course we'll spend some time talking about emerald ash borer, and both in its, talk about emerald ash borer. And following emerald ash borer, we'll talk about the ecological role of black ash and how emerald ash borer threatens those functions. The middle section of today's webinar will talk about our efforts in Vermont over the last year and a half before transitioning into what is next in the future of black ash in Vermont. And just to reiterate, as Ginger mentioned, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat or hold them until the end of the presentation. And I'm hoping to have about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So how to ID an ash tree? In Vermont, we have 3 different species of ash. We have white, green, and black. White ash is pictured on, there's a white ash leaf pictured on the right here. They're fairly common in our upland forests, particularly in areas with slight enrichment. Green ash, which is pictured on the left in the spring before flowering. They're most common in our urban environments where they've been commonly planted along roadways. And they were kind of the go-to tree after Dutch elm disease swept through North America. And they also thrive in lake floodplain environments. And then black ash, which is pictured in the center, that's the bark of a black ash. They prefer wet environments that are seasonally inundated, like forested swamps, floodplains, and ditches. All of these ash trees have opposite branching, which means that as the tree shoots out new growth, it does so in pairs of branches. And so you have these opposite branches connecting to the, or these branches connecting to the trunk in pairs. That is somewhat unique, but maples, dogwoods, caprifoliaceae, or viburnums, they all exhibit that kind of opposite branching behavior. But most of our trees in Vermont are alternate branching, so they'll shoot out one branch and then the next will be a little bit offset from that. Other notable things about ash that make them distinctive is the stoutness of the twig. So the branches, the twigs, as they come off of the main stem, are pretty robust in size. And that's something that you can pretty quickly develop an eye for. The pattern of bark varies quite a bit between species, but typically has some element of diamond furrowed or patterned bark. In the center, the black ash that's shown, generally black ash have the least amount of that kind of diamond patterning, but in the more furrowed, more deeply furrowed black ash, you can really see that diamond pattern. And then ash also have compound leaves, which means that each leaf has multiple leaflets joined by a stalk to a woody stem. And that's pictured here on the right. So black ash ID. Well, quickly, I'm going to talk more about the range and the general ecology, because where we see a tree can also help to inform what tree we might be looking at. So black ash are found from eastern North Dakota to southeastern Manitoba, to northwest Newfoundland to Delaware. And they are slow growing trees and tend to grow in forested depressional wetlands. These areas where they grow are generally poorly drained or seasonally inundated, and often have muck and peat soils, or occasionally sandy or loamy soils underlain by some sort of clay or impermeable layer that's causing that area to be poorly drained. They prefer, the trees themselves prefer hummocky sites, like little micro topographies within the wetlands. And they're generally shade intolerant, which is important for regeneration. So moving towards the ID now, black ash, again, are opposite branching with pinnately compound leaves, which is pictured on the left. And most leaves have 7 to 11 leaflets, averaging around 9 per leaf. The leaflets are sessile to the leaf stem. So as you can see in this picture, the leaflets attach directly to the main stem of the leaf. There's no little stalk attaching the leaflets. And that is unique of black ash in Vermont's 3 ash species. It's called being sessile. There's no little petioliole. And in a green ash, you have a very small petioliole attaching that leaflet to the stem. And in a white ash, there's a longer petioliole. In the center, we have that black ash bark that's deeply furrowed. It's corky. When you touch it, it like squishes. But it can vary considerably between young and older trees. And also depending on the orientation to the sun. So we tend to see like more deeply furrowed bark on south-facing aspects of trees. And some trees have more like almost scaly type of bark instead of deeply furrowed. And then on the right, we have the terminal bud of a black ash, and they have that like classic Hershey kiss kind of shaped bud. I would mention that generally ash ID is really challenging. I was recently reading a study where a group of scientists obtained a handful of different commercially available ash trees, and then before using them in the study, they ran their genotypes, and 70% of the ash had been incorrectly identified. So ash ID is really, it's a great skill to hone, and it's also just generally a very challenging endeavor. Moving on to cultural importance of black ash. Black ash holds significant cultural value and is a keystone for many Indigenous peoples in northeastern North America. And the information that I'm going to share with you about that significance comes from personal communication with Indigenous people in Vermont and in Maine, as well as descriptions that I found in peer-reviewed literature. There are many recorded ethnobotanical uses of black ash, including lacrosse sticks made by Mohawk, barrels made by Iroquois, medicinal uses for rheumatism and loosening bowels, and black ash baskets made by many tribes. In northeastern North America, the Abenaki tribes and the St. Regis Mohawk tribes both have a really long documented history of black ash basketry. And there are several types of these baskets, including larger utility baskets and smaller, more ornamental or decorative baskets. And the more ornamental or decorative baskets have often been used ceremonially, such as in the exchange of, an exchange of baskets in wedding ceremonies. They've also historically and to this day been sold as a means of subsistence. And locally, I just want to mention that black ash is also featured in a Abenaki creation story that is told by the Vermont tribes. The use of black ash wood in basket making traditions is due to its supple yet strong nature. And so the way it grows, it's ring porous, which means that each year the tree puts on a layer of spring wood, which is pretty porous, and then it'll put on a denser summer growth. And when the log is then stripped of bark and subjected to pounding, the wood actually splits along the soft spring growth, and it can be peeled into splints that are ideal for basketry, barrel hoops, snowshoe frames, canoe ribs, and material for woven chair seats. But while that sounds easy and lovely, the overall act of locating, felling, and processing black ash trees is really quite complicated and very intensively physical, and also requires a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that's been passed down through generations. And through experience, basket makers have learned that only 5 to 20% of black ash trees are actually basket quality, which is why understanding what to look for or where to look for these trees is so important. A couple of things that inform whether or not a tree is of basket quality include how many years of thick growth, thick being about 2 to 3 millimeters for folks who are using an increment bore, and also looking for slightly larger trees. Depending on the resource or the person, you might be looking for anywhere between 5 and 12 inches diameter at breast height. So those are a couple of size specifications that folks look for. Other aspects that inform whether or not a black ash might be a basket quality tree include site hydrology. So sites with ponding water tend to slow growth and therefore be of lower quality. Microtopography, trees that are growing on slightly higher microsites tend to have less saturation and therefore can grow more per year. Having less surrounding competition, including herb cover and conifers, contributes to higher quality trees, as does greater light availability. And then the height of the bole, as some folks say that as you increase or you move up the stem of a black ash, the quality of the wood actually deteriorates. And so having wood that is free of defects lower down on the tree can indicate higher quality trees. Bark texture, canopy, and stand and species composition also all figure into the quality of these trees. In Vermont, there are several active Indigenous and non-Indigenous basket makers. And on the left side of the screen, you're seeing a handful of baskets made by Carrie Wood, who's a local Abenaki basket maker. And she has really helped to inform this project, and I'm so grateful for her input and kindness. She also happens to make incredibly beautiful baskets. And then the photo on the right was taken at an ash pounding event in the Nulhegan Basin in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont last summer. Jumping into the history of EAB, first, I'm going to talk about these photos, where they're from and what they show. On the left, we have a green ash in Alberg Dunes State Park that shows pretty extensive girdling, those characteristic serpentine galleries, and from emerald ash borer larvae, and then some of that bark starting to slough off the tree. And then on the right, we have a pretty small diameter black ash that was extensively infested in L.R. Jones State Park in the center of the state. So emerald ash borer, it's native to China, Eastern Russia, and the Korean Peninsula. It was first detected in North America in 2002 in the Detroit area, and it's caused high mortality in every member of the Fraxinus genus ever since it arrived in the US. Prior to its detection in the US, there was very little known about it. In its native range, it just kind of exists as a background pest. It's detected in low levels in a lot of locations, but does not detrimentally affect its native host, the Manchurian ash. From the initial introduction of EAB in Michigan, this invasive borer has spread to other regions of North America and was first detected in Vermont in 2017. And a little bit about the life cycle of how this non-native beetle affects our trees. So the female they deposit the eggs. Ideally, they prefer crevices, like more creviced bark. But they'll deposit those eggs on the bark, and then after the larvae will emerge from the eggs and chew into the phloem of the ash tree, where they create serpentine-shaped galleries as they feed in an upwards motion. And as they grow, those galleries grow both in width but also in actual size. And the galleries, as the density of larvae increases, the galleries intersect and begin to girdle the tree. And that girdling process cuts off the flow of nutrients and water. And in response, the ash bark begins to slough off the tree, and the tree will produce epicormic sprouts. And so far, black ash haven't shown any resistance to EAB. White ash sometimes can show like up to 20% resistance in a stand. And green ash show a tiny bit of resistance, like maybe 1%, but up to this point, all infested black ash trees have succumbed to mortality within 3 to 5 years. Backing up pre-EAB, black ash decline has actually been observed for several decades, mostly by indigenous basket makers across the Midwest, but also in Maine. And in the 1990s, the Maine tribes, the Abenaki Confederacy, formed the Black Ash Task Force Group in response to concerns about the observed decline in black ash health and population. This tree species has been around for a really long time. It actually diverged phylogenetically from Manchurian ash 18 million years ago as its own individual species. So that's like through the Pleistocene, through the Pliocene. It's been around for a long time, and it's now exhibiting pretty serious dieback, the pre-EAB. So what other than EAB might be contributing to black ash decline? Well, anthropogenic activities such as road building, because it changes hydrologic flow, runoff of road salt, car and truck emissions, and pollutants, as well as other diseases and unknown causes. But today, circling back to EAB is the biggest threat to the future of black ash, and scientists predict that the EAB infestation will lead to functional extirpation of the species, most likely. So ecological importance of black ash. This is something that I get pretty excited about, so I'll try and keep it nice and tight. But black ash has numerous ecological roles, including readily observable functions like providing food for wildlife. Numerous species consume black ash seeds, including wood ducks, quail, bobwhite, purple finches, pine grosbeaks, beavers, porcupines, white-footed mice, and turkeys. And then other species like ungulates, moose, and deer browse on the young shoots of black ash seedlings and saplings. But not all ecosystem functions are as visible. So since the discovery of the North American EAB infestation in 2002, there have been a number of studies looking at the different ecological functions of this tree. And I'm going to run through them. The first is hydrology. So studies have looked at what's going on with sap flux in these ecosystems, in these wetlands. And sap flux is a measure of how much sap is ascending through the xylem tissue of a tree. And it's a really good analog for how much the tree is transpiring, or how much water that tree is breathing out into the air. And what they found is between 3 different species that often co-inhabit these forested wetlands, so yellow birch, red maple, and black ash. Black ash had a sap flux rate that was 80 to 160% higher than non-black ash species. And so black ash is able to just like breathe out so much of that water from these inundated wetlands. And that is really important because having too much water relative to average in an ecological system can deplete oxygen in the soil and inhibit oxygen uptake in roots, thereby inhibiting plant growth. There are additional variables to consider when talking about a hydrologic regime, such as is the water mostly sourced from surface water or from precipitation or from groundwater, but generally these ecosystems are expected to have more prolonged soil saturation and inundation. What that means for forest composition is likely shrubification of these wetland systems. So zooming out a little bit and thinking back pre-EAB, we had that long-term black ash decline. And because black ash have been dying in some of these longer term, some of these wetlands in the Midwest, it offered the opportunity to study what's coming back after black ash disappear naturally from a system. And what's been found is stands with greater black ash canopy dieback and mortality. Replacement was highest by speckled alder, which is a shrubby species that does not reach canopy standards. And so this suggests that long-term, the combination of increased water levels in the stands and as a result of black ash die-off is that there will be a conversion to open shrubland in historically black ash dominated forested wetlands. Then thinking about nutrient cycling in the aquatic community, black ash leaf litter has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio than other species that contribute to the leaf litter in these wetland systems. And it also contributes more mineralized nitrogen to the ecosystem because of that lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So losing black ash from the systems is likely to lead to lower quality conditions for detritivores and likely impact their population and function. And then finally, greenhouse gas flux and carbon storage. Scientists have found that EAB mortality is likely to lead to increased fluxes of nitrous oxide and methane, which are both potent greenhouse gases. And that's combined with evidence from the FIA data from 2010 that revealed that ash in North America contained approximately 1.9 petagrams of above ground carbon, which contributed about 1.5% of the world's gross primary productivity. So some pretty heavy findings. I mean, it's an incredible tree, contributes a lot to ecosystems, but not a great time to be facing the loss of all of those things. And so in Vermont, we've been curious about, okay, how do we bring this home? How do we bring this to our state? What is going on with black ash specifically in Vermont, and what can we do to help mitigate the problem of EAB? So the first thing that we did was to propose and establish 18 different plots, long-term monitoring plots across 10 sites. And the goal was to understand more about the distribution of black ash in Vermont, and so where they grow and also how they're doing, and how much of these forested wetlands they actually, how much basal area they actually take up. And the picture on, or the map on the left-hand side is an earlier map. And so it has more than 10 sites, but we did visit all of the sites, and black ash is a little bit fickle. It doesn't always show up in your expected natural community, and in the muck and peat, you know, all of the remote sensing doesn't always provide the trees that you were hoping to find, but we established trees in the majority of those locations that are mapped, and have pretty good representation from north to south. And in each site, we looked at basal area, species composition, herbaceous species, basket quality characteristics of black ash in the site, pH, regeneration, and a variety of other variables. Because these are long-term monitoring plots, they are intended to exist for many years, with periodic study occurring every like 3 to 5, maybe even 10 years, depending on what variables are going to be studied in the long term. And the future of the plots is now in the hands of Joanne Garton, who also is with Vermont Urban Community Forestry Program, and Tony D'Amato, who works at UVM. And they're looking at possibly growing the number of plots to increase the possibilities for experimentation and the robustness of the findings, but also thinking about, okay, what will the plots be used for long term? Is it experimentation with insecticide injections? Is it looking at viability of different underplanting species, or just measuring how plot composition changes over time? Some of the initial findings from, or I should say the initial trends from a year of plot establishment. So in the upper left hand, we have black ash canopy health by site. And what I want to point out there is that in general, these plots were standardized in the same size, but in general, we didn't have a ton of black ash, with the exception of Tinmouth Channel, which is like a huge, seemingly hotspot for black ash in Vermont, or like just the sheer density of black ash. But we also don't have a lot of trees in a significant state of decline. Canopy surveys have been proven to be a really good analog for the amount of stress that a tree is experiencing. And so with the exception of Tinmouth Channel, which had a pretty large population of black ash, we only see canopy level 5 die, like black ash that only have epicormic sprouting. That's the only sign of life in Alberg Dunes State Park, which currently has an EAB infestation. But this is the baseline data that will inform how quickly things change and what happens to our black ash in the future as the EAB infestation progresses through Vermont. In the lower left, we have bowl condition by site. This was an attempt to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge with management. The Black Ash Task Force up in Maine has recommended prioritizing high quality basket trees for preservation efforts. And so here's an example of how, a small sample, but how the quality of black ash for basket making might correlate with different natural communities or locations in Vermont. It also shows that a higher quality bowl is a bowl level 1s, that dark green. The number of high quality black ash trees was pretty low, and that correlates with what the research and Indigenous basket makers say about, only 5 to 20% of black ash are actually suitable for basket making. And so it's a pretty low sample that we're working with, or a low number of trees that are of basket quality. And then finally, in the lower right, we have percent black ash by basal area. We see that in Vermont, black ash they're not the predominant species in these wetlands, unlike in the Midwest, where there are acres and acres and acres that are almost entirely black ash. And so in Vermont, it's unlikely that we'll see the same kind of dramatic change in our ecosystems. A couple of the plants that I got to spend a lot of time with this summer that occur out in those black ash swamps. Just want to give you a sense of what it looks like out there. We have swamp candles on the upper left, and then to the right of swamp candles, we have Canada lily. On the upper right, I don't remember exactly which species this is, but there were so many sedges, some sort of carex sedge, I believe. And then lower left, we have sensitive fern, then swamp milkweed and false nettle. And the final picture on the lower right is common barberry. Just to remind myself to mention that while there aren't a ton of invasives in these plots, it's definitely possible that as we see black ash start to die out, there will be canopy gaps that open, and species like buckthorn or barberry or other invasives that are pretty prominent in Vermont might start to move into those areas. And so that's another opportunity for intentional and active management. If you're curious about reading more or looking through more of our data, there are 2 story plots that are linked on our website under the Black Ash Project. The first is Black Ash long-term monitoring plots. It has the data I just shared with you, as well as data going through each and every one of the sites, and some more descriptive information. And then the second story plot, story map called I Like to Get My Feet Wet. as a little bit more anecdotal kind of stories from a field of, or some stories from a summer of data collection and exploration in the field. Another facet of our work has been trying to incorporate more community science into Black ash in Vermont. So on iNaturalist, we have two different projects. The one that's pictured is the Vermont Black ash inventory, where folks can intentionally add observations of black ash to the inventory and fill out optional fields such as who owns the land that this black ash is located on, would they be open to basket maker access and harvest, what are there signs of EAB in the area, what is the quality of the tree from an untrained or trained eye. And then the other project is a collection project that's basically just an umbrella project, and any observation of black ash in Vermont that's added to iNaturalist is fed into this project. And it just gives us a sense of, okay, what is the distribution like, and what are where are folks really interested in this tree, and what are opportunities for forming more community around the tree. Another facet of our project has been working with NR 206 students at UVM. So backing up a little bit, in the last summer, with the help of Kate Forer, I sent out an email to folks involved with town forests in Vermont. And we were asking, hey, if you have black ash in your town forest and you know about it, could you let us know so that we can try and incorporate it in our project? And we got a handful of responses back, but I just didn't have the capacity last summer to dive into that to dive into that component of black ash in Vermont. And then this fall, I had the incredible opportunity to work with a group of undergrads from UVM to go to three of these municipally owned parcels and measure black ash, and then add those to the iNaturalist project. What the undergrad students then did is so in the upper right-hand corner, this is an example of what I'm talking about. They overlaid iNaturalist collection points, which are blue dots, with muck and peat, that black and white, or that black hatching pattern, and abundant black ash natural communities that have been mapped in Vermont. And the reason they chose those different variables was based on what they'd found in the fields while they were out mapping in Ferrisburgh and in Williston and in Huntington. So they pulled from their observations in those towns and then extrapolated it on GIS using those three variables and determined what other town forests might have black ash. They then compiled a list of folks who are involved in management in those forests, those town forests, and reached out to them saying, hey, you might have black ash in your forest. If you do, consider these approaches for management and consider basket maker access. They put together a story map based on their findings in a resource packet. Both of those are also available on our website. And there's also a really incredible interactive map that is wonderful to explore. And finally, the last kind of facet of my focus, and Joanne and my focus over the last year, but I suppose this is a bit more recent, is an intake form. So when Joanne and I were preparing for a webinar that we helped the Vermont Land Trust with a couple of months back, we were thinking, okay, like if people have black ash on their land, what do they do? What are their options? And so we decided to pilot an intake form. So landowners who have black ash and are open to harvest can share their information, share general info about the trees. And then when we receive that, we reach back out to them and try and set up an opportunity to go and check out those trees. On the other end, we've been working to reach out to different folks in Vermont and compile a network of people who actively create black ash baskets or are involved in some sort of black ash artisanry. And we have that list of like 15 or so people. And the goal is to connect these landowners who have black ash with the people who are hoping to process that wood into different types of art or into utilitarian baskets. We recognize that there's a pretty big gap between just having landowners with trees and having these artisans, because in the middle, there's a lot of effort required to fell the tree, to transport the tree, to pound the tree, and to create a lot of splints. But that is where some of our future work comes in. Moving forward, there's a lot of emphasis on community involvement, trying to procure funding and provide support for additional pounding and community workshops that elevate traditional ecological knowledge and connect people to each other and to their place, their landscape. The two photos on this slide, on the left is Aaron Wood, who is a member of the Nulhegan Band in Vermont, and he is preparing a black ash log for pounding at the Ethan Allen Homestead pounding event last April. And on the right is a picture of some folks pounding a log at the Nulhegan Basin pounding event. It's a lot of work to pound one of these trees into splints. And it takes a lot of energy and time and knowledge to get the trees from standing into one of those beautiful baskets like the ones of Carrie's that I displayed earlier. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of facilitating or supporting this process for different Indigenous basket makers around the state and regionally. Moving on to other kind of future steps with EAB and black ash, as well as ash generally in Vermont. I'm going to touch briefly on EAB biocontrol efforts, which is a more landscape level management approach. This work is funded by the USDA Plant Protection Program, and it's an effort to establish populations of parasitoid wasps that parasitize EAB in North America. And it's an effort that's being carried out by state land agencies, state by state. So far, Vermont's Forest Protection Program has released wasps in L.R. Jones State Forest and South Hero and Whipstock Hill WMA in Bennington. These are non-native wasps that were first identified in China and then collected, brought to the States for rearing, underwent a rigorous evaluation program before being released into the wild, because it was determined that there just weren't native parasitoids that were capable of slowing the spread of EAB. The parasitoid wasps that have been released have not shown any host switching, and really only target Agrillus planipennisi, which is the emerald ash borer, and have not been shown to switch to any of our native Agrillus species. But in Vermont, starting next year, the state is, or starting this year actually, the state will begin monitoring the parasitoid population levels and dispersal to determine if there are sufficient levels of parasitoid wasps and sufficient levels to actually start slowing the spread of EAB. And the goal is to give native ash trees a little more time to respond and to adopt the infestation. And I'm just going to speak briefly about the 3 different species that are being released in Vermont currently. On the right-hand side of this slide is Spathius gallinae, which is a larval parasitoid with a longer ovipositor, and it can parasitize larvae in ash trees up to about 23 inches in diameter. On the left, we have Oobius agrili, which injects its own eggs into EAB eggs, thereby killing the host eggs. Only females are released as they can reproduce without mating, and they arrive in these little pill bottles called oobinators. And then the third species, which isn't pictured here, is Tetrasticus planipennisi, which is another larval parasitoid, similar to Spathius gallinae, but they have a smaller ovipositor and can only penetrate into ash trees with diameters less than 6 inches in dBH. And they arrive in little bolts of wood that are then tied to tree branches, ash branches. Another form of EAB control involves injecting insecticides into the trunks of ash trees. And the outcome of the injection is affected by the timing of injection. as well as the tree health and size and the existing EAB pressure in the area. So far, emamectin benzoate seems to be the most effective insecticide to use. And injecting this insecticide requires drilling into the base of the tree through the bark and into the outer sapwood. So in both of the photos pictured here, the folks who are providing those injections have actually used a drill to drill in, and then they insert a plug and then inject the insecticide through a pressurized machine. And these wounds that are sustained during that drilling process normally recover by the end of the growing season, so it's not a huge stress to the tree. The ideal timing for injection occurs after leaf out of the ash trees, but before the EAB eggs hatch. And the timing is also important because it's a time of year when there tends to be a lot of water, and the injected trees require a steady source of water to allow for insecticide to be translocated throughout the tree. Injections of emamectin benzoate tend to provide protection for 2 to 3 years after injection. And it's been being used since 2009. And because it's being injected directly into the tree, it minimizes the possibility for spread into the surrounding soil or surrounding trees. I should mention there are other options for insecticide application through things like sprays or like dredges, but emamectin benzoate through direct injection does seem to be the most effective and the least impactful on the surrounding system. However, despite it being considered economical, it's still about $10 per inch diameter at breast height, and so it's pretty costly, depending on your budget. It can be pretty costly to protect a number of trees every other year. And then the last or second to last thing I'll mention about the future of black ash in Vermont is seed collection efforts. So black ash trees are mostly dioecious, although some bear both male and female flowers. So most black ash trees are either male or female. And the flowers mature on both trees around the same time, although males tend to mature shortly before the females. And they can be differentiated based on their form. The male flowers are more compact and the females are more like elongate and kind of spindly. And after the black ash pollen from the male flowers is disseminated through by wind, the female flowers are fertilized, and at that point they begin maturing into single-seeded samaras that hang from the ash branches and clusters. Depending on the location, the seeds mature anytime between July and October, at which point they start to turn, when they're mature, they start to turn a slightly more brown color, and the endosperm is white. Before germinating, the seeds do require cold stratification, which makes artificial germination a little bit more challenging. But in an average natural cycle, the seeds germinate 2 years after maturation, and can remain viable in the seed bank for up to 8 years. Good seed crops occur in intervals of approximately every 4 years, but varying from 3 to 5. So we just had a big seed year last year in Vermont, so it'll probably be 3 to 5 years before we have another big seed year. And interestingly, the abundance of the periods of abundant seed production are not affected by EAB pressure and also not affected by flooding conditions. There are a variety of different seed collections that have been used by folks like the St. Regis Mohawk or up in Maine. And there are some incredible resources, including Les Benedict and Richard David's 2003 manual. And then the APCA team, Ash Protection and Collaboration Across Abenaki team from University of Maine has, I believe they just released a new ash seed collection manual, and they're super responsive and wonderful to work with when thinking about more seed collection efforts. But just to touch a little bit more about ash seed collection, after collection, the ash seeds do need to be cleaned, stems can be removed, and then the seeds need to be dried until moisture levels reach the desired 7 to 10%. And those collected and dried seeds can be stored for up to 8 years in sealed containers at 5 degrees Celsius. But long-term storage does require specialized facilities. And there are a handful of facilities out in Iowa and Colorado that are storing those seeds, and that folks can send seeds into to increase the genetic diversity of stored seeds. But again, in Vermont, looks like we'll have another couple years before the next big bumper crop, and hopefully by that time there are more systems in that can help, or systems and folks and resources to collect seeds while we still have a lot of black ash and green and white ash in the landscape. Finally, what is likely to start growing in these forests as black ash starts to dwindle? These are a couple photos that I took in, well, most of them came from black ash swamps, not all though. But up on the left, we have swamp white oak. And then moving to the right on the upper row, we have speckled alder. That's a shrub, but really coming in strong in these systems. Then yellow birch, sugar maple, especially in those sugar maple floodplain forests where black ash also co-occurs as an abundant species. And then we have red maple on the lower left, hackberry. That's not one that I personally observed in the plots, but it is well cited in the literature as a possible species that's going to thrive, or be, maybe not thrive, but do well in forested wetland ecosystems. And then we have American elm, and the final picture is meant to represent northern white cedar, which is also projected to do okay as black ash disappears. Species that are not pictured here include silver maple and basswood. And some folks are also talking about Manchurian ash as a possible underplanting in these, that could be planted in black ash wetlands to mitigate the effect of losing black ash on the landscape and on the ecology. And moving now to questions.
Great. So thank you so much, Shar. That was really, really wonderful. And I'm always so impressed by how much work you accomplished in a small amount of time. We've got a bunch of great questions coming in, and please continue submitting them. Before we get to the questions, I just want to note that one of our participants today, who's an Indigenous person, Bob Littletree, it reminded us that one of the preferred terms now is to moving away from tribe, which is sort of an imposed word, to band or nation. So with that, Tom Norton was the first question. If you can see that wondering if anybody's done any research or has thoughts about how, if we're prioritizing good basket making trees for the insecticide treatment, how that the insecticide might impact the quality of the wood splints.
Yeah, I was chatting with, I've had a similar conversation with a handful of folks, and it's a great question, Tom. To my understanding is that the goal of the insecticide treatments is to preserve the genetic lineage that might contribute to higher basket quality trees. And while the injected tree would theoretically, after a certain number of years, I don't remember the actual half-life of emamectin benzoate, but after the half-life runs its course, the tree would theoretically be usable for splints. But people who, scientists who are studying emamectin benzoate have said they personally would not use those trees for splints. So the goal is like long-term, not necessarily using that specific, preserving that specific tree for splints, but rather long-term retaining trees long-term on our landscape.
For
That
the genetics. Great, thank you. And then Michael asked, does blackgrass ash grow in association with hackberry, Celtis occidentalis, and in a riparian hardwood forest where you might find wild leek, or is it much wetter conditions that they like to grow in?
Ooh, this is a great question. I actually haven't seen, it's a really good question. I haven't seen leeks or ramps in conjunction with black ash, but it does grow with, I think, is Thuja occidentalis the same thing as Celtis occidentalis? Similar.
I don't think so.
Is- Oh, northern hackberry. Yeah. Okay, I see. I haven't observed hackberry in Vermont in conjunction uh with black ash, but it's just cited in the literature as a species that is recommended to underplant and to do well. Yeah, if you noticed on the slide, that picture of hackberry is from an urban environment, not from a plot.
Great, thank you. And then from Joanne Garton, do you know if the quality of black ash for basket making is influenced mostly by genetics or more by the growing conditions?
Joanne, that's a really great question too. uh, I don't think there have been any studies on it. Everything I've read speaks more to the ecology of black ash and how that affects basket quality. But if there are trees that are being preserved for future basket making endeavors, I think the intent is to maximize the potential quality.
Yeah. So I have a question, and then it looks like Joanne might have one. You talked a little bit about underplanting. And I know this is not the focus of your work, but because black ash stands are so important ecologically in terms of the hydrology of areas, do you know of any states or communities that are actively now doing the underplanting to try to protect some of these wetlands and keep trees in them so that they don't get taken over by grasses and sedges?
I don't know of any underplantings that are, I mean, it's possible that they're occurring. I've really only read the studies about what is recommended to plant and what's been successful in those studies, nothing about actual implementation. So possible, something I will look into further.
Okay, great, thanks. Joanne, was there something that you wanted to share?
Thanks, yeah, Ginger, and then thank you, Shar, to echo Ginger's thoughts. Like, absolutely amazing how many pieces you pull together in 1 hour of talking. I did kind of have a broad question about community. Since Shar and I have been working together for over a year now, a big goal of the urban and community forestry program is to really think carefully about what the word community means and think about that being a municipality, which is often what governs our term community, but also think more broadly and creatively. And I wonder, Shar, in your experience in the last year and change, who is the community interested in black ash? There's basket makers, both indigenous and non-indigenous. And who else, like, could you make any generalizations about who you've met working on this project, and if any of those types of communities have like really surprised you?
That's yeah, wow. I I think most people who hear the story of black ash and start to understand the ecology and the cultural significance of the species become invested. And the folks who already know that, or a lot of folks who already know that, are like foresters or botanists or tree wardens, of course. But then don't know that this is specifically answering your question, but that the possibility for that community is pretty big. Having worked with like the NR 206 students, they became so deeply invested over the course of a semester, or like me knowing very little about Black ash prior to starting this project. It's something that I feel I could always be learning more about or doing more to help protect. And so I think it's a really great example of a species with both cultural and ecological importance, and it's also a very timely matter. Like there's kind of an end point on the horizon at which point our efforts don't do much more, and I think that just kind of captivates the interest of a lot of different folks and provides for a pretty large potential community.
Thank you. Oh, you're still muted, Ginger.
Thank you. It looks like Beth has a question.
Yes. So at Niquette Bay State Park, there are black ash along a trail near the lake. And I noticed that over the last winter, the beaver, there was a beaver busy down there that had chewed off some of the larger trees. And actually it must have been before the winter, because there were shoots coming up from below where the beaver had eaten them off. If the emerald ash borer only lays its eggs primarily in rougher bark, is there some? So I kind of thought, well, that's a huge shame. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, maybe these trees will keep living because they're smaller stems coming up that have no rough bark. And if the ash borers prefer the rough bark, they won't bother the tree for, I don't know. I'm just not sure how to feel about that, I guess.
Beth, I've walked through that area a handful of times and looked at those trees. That was the anyway, but yeah, so vegetative reproduction as a means for kind of avoiding the impacts of infestation is something that has been studied. So setting up those shoots, but once a stem reaches 2.5 inches in diameter, it becomes susceptible to the infestation. And so unlike, say, Dutch elm disease, which doesn't affect elms until they're beyond flowering age, 2.5 inches in diameter, like when an ash reaches 2.5 inches in diameter, it's not yet flowering or reproductive. And so unfortunately, it doesn't look like trees that are producing epicormic sprouts or reproducing vegetatively are going to be able to make it through the infestation. However, I did recently read this really interesting study of a lab that was collecting ash leaves and subjecting them to conditions where the actual ash leaf turned into a vegetative shoot. And so that's really exciting, because what folks are finding in seed banks in ash forests is that the seed bank becomes pretty rapidly depleted over the course of about 8 years. So if you have an alternative means of sourcing ash for like future planting or for future genetic endeavors, it's just a pretty exciting development.
Wow. Thank you so much, Shar. We're at almost about 1:30, which is our time to end. I don't know, do you need to jump off, or do you have time to answer these last two questions for anyone who's able to stay on?
I can stick around for whoever's staying on. Yeah.
Okay, we just have two more questions, and then we understand if people have to leave. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Laura Edling asks if qualities that make for good basket making are largely genetic rather than based on conditions. Does that provide some hope for seed saving?
I'm not totally sure what the question is intended to get at here. Like, I don't think I understand the question. Laura, would you mind unmuting yourself and asking the question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about seed saving efforts. And, I'm imagining that some seed saving efforts would be targeted towards trees that show some resiliency, but given that black ash isn't showing any resiliency, if there might be efforts at seed saving for those trees that are just, good quality, good, make for good baskets, basically. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, somebody asked, maybe it was Joanne, or somebody asked if it was genetic. I think that was, unless I got that wrong, unless it is largely based on more environmental conditions.
So my response to Joanne's question was that I haven't read about anything that's like specifically says that qualities are genetic, just that the Maine Black Ash Task Force has recommended prioritizing basket quality trees for preservation efforts with insecticide. But with seed saving, like Vermont are kind of far behind right now compared to like efforts in Maine, and so it's generally like there's a lot of emphasis and effort being put into seed saving, and that's definitely a spot for Vermont to step up in the coming years.
Yeah. Guess it's a matter of funding.
Yeah. So last question, and then we will wrap up and let folks go. What's your assessment about the potential future ability of the parasitic wasps and biocontrols to control EAB populations?
I have been reading, I guess I can only, I'm an eternally optimistic person, but based on what I've been reading, there is definitely there's hope for white ash in conjunction with biocontrol releases. Black ash, I haven't read anything specifically about. I hope that we have enough time to figure something out. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't read anything specifically about what's going on with biocontrol and black ash resistance, but Tyler Everett's work up in Maine, he is looking to compare across plots, including biocontrol as one of the variables in his ash plots. So an indirect answer to Tom, but that's the best that I can do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Shar. Is there anything that you would like to say to wrap things up?
Oh, did I see Nancy's hand go
Oh,
up?
yes. Nancy shared that one of the intentions behind preserving the best basket tree is out of respect for these trees and trying to preserve them, and especially those trees that have that quality.
Yeah, I agree. Respect for the trees is huge. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Nancy.
Yeah, just like we want to save all members of our communities. So Shar, thank you so much, and good luck to you in whatever you end up doing next. And thank you everyone for joining us today. There will be an email sent out with a recording of this. So take care, everybody.